Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and today what we're going to do is take a look at all of the non-meta decks, all of the non-super popular decks that still did well in competitions in Pokemon TCG Pocket tournaments over this past week. So again, we like to talk about the best decks on the channel. I like to inform you guys as to what the metagame looks like and what decks are at the top, what decks you really should be playing from a competitive standpoint, but it's also good to reflect and take a look at all of the decks that aren't really considered, the top tier strategies or the most commonly played decks, the most popular decks, but still can win games and still do well and did well in online competition, right? So the first deck we're going to take a look at here is going to be Palkia with actually Empoleon. This player here at the President Pocket Turtle Tournament went 9-3. Let's take a look at the matches here. So a couple early wins against Exeggutor. Again, also what somebody might have commented or talked about earlier is that some decks like this in some smaller tournaments sometimes get free wins by their opponents not showing up, and that definitely does happen sometimes. So take these win rates with a little bit of a grain of salt, but I mostly selected decks that certainly won a lot of games against like real matches and real players. But anyway, these smaller tournaments open up the room a lot for these decks that aren't necessarily super meta or super popular to still do well, because again, it's a little bit smaller of a sample size, but it's still very impressive to see decks that aren't, very, popular, I guess, or very, common strategies still winning games and still doing good. So this player here, like I said, won 2 Exeggutor matchups, beat a lost to Darkrai Magnezone, lost to Wormadam Skarmory, and then ended up beating Infernape Skarmory, Exeggutor, Charizard, and then won here in top 64 again with a bye, but ended up also beating Darkrai Magnezone in another Infernape deck. So yes, this is a water type deck, and we did run into 3 fire type decks, a big reason why the deck did do well, but it did beat a couple Magnezone and Darkrai decks, which is pretty interesting to take a look at. Let's go ahead and look at the list. So this is going to be predominantly still just a Palkia deck, but it does incorporate the new Empoleon card from Space Time Smackdown. So again, Empoleon in its own right, just not very commonly is going to see a ton of play. It's not a card that we've actually seen a lot recently. It is a basic, or not a basic, it's a stage 2 Pokemon, but it's a single prize Pokemon, not an EX Pokemon. So yes, we do have 150 HP and the attack is fairly strong. We can do 80 damage to the active and then 30 damage to one of our opponent's bench Pokemon for only 3 energies, with Manaphy being able to, accelerate those energies with Oceanic Gift and then go and move those energies to Empoleon maybe in the late game with Vaporeon's washout ability. It is pretty cool. It is a really, really niche Pokemon, but it actually does have a pretty significant attack here. We're only running 1 copy of Piplup and Primplup and Empoleon, so a lot of people might be thinking like, listen, this probably isn't the best card to be playing with Palkia. I've seen better Palkia lists, but that's not what this video is about. Again, I just wanted to showcase some, non-meta, strategies and cards that have found their way into actual winning deck lists. So I thought it was really, really interesting to see Empoleon actually doing pretty well, making it, again, if we go back, I think he made it into top 8. He lost in top 8 of this tournament, which is pretty impressive no matter how you slice it, so shout out to this player. And I do like Empoleon as a card. Now, typically with stage 2 Pokemon, they need to have a ton of upside for us to run them in the deck. This deck here is only running 1 copy of all of them, which makes it a little bit less consistent. Of course, there's a lot of different Pokemon in the deck here, which is going to kind of make the flow of the deck a little bit less consistent overall. But again, 1 copy of Eevee and 1 copy of Vaporeon. So if we look at just the basic Pokemon in the deck, we still have 2 Palkia, 2 Manaphy, and yes, we have 1 Piplup and 1 Eevee, but we should be starting with either Palkia and Manaphy most of the time. And the cool thing about Piplup is we can actually sort of attack on curve, meaning, basically turn 1 we can attach to Piplup, turn 2 we can attack with Primplup, and then turn 3 with 3 energies we can attack on Empoleon. So it does have that upside. Yes, Magnezone is pretty common in the format right now. Being weak to electric isn't great. And yes, basically every card in our deck is weak to electric, but the Empoleon attack is actually really interesting. I think it does have some pretty good synergy with both Cyrus as well as Palkia's Dimensional Storm attack, which is of course going to be sort of the main factor in the deck, but probably a big reason why this deck won. But Empoleon definitely can put in work. It's really interesting to see, how, this card could be incorporated into decks like this one, which I really do like. I think if we're playing Empoleon, we probably have to kind of splash it into an already established water archetype. Palkia makes sense because, again, it focuses primarily around the basic Pokemon, so there's more room in the deck, but I do really like Empoleon. I think this is really, really cool. 80 to the active is not a small amount of damage. It can finish a lot of different KOs, while also, 30 damage is a pretty big number as well to the bench. So I think Empoleon could be cool. Like, we could pair it with maybe Greninja and some other Pokemon to kind of start off. I think it could be really, really interesting, but unfortunately, like I said, it's just weak to electric and that can be tough. But yeah, I did want to include it because I do think it's a really, really cool card, and it hasn't really seen much play yet, but this list did pop out to me, so I wanted to showcase it in this particular video. And next up, we've got this player here who went 7-3 in the same tournament playing Dragonite, and this is going to be a very cool Dragonite deck. We haven't actually talked about Dragonite really at all. Let's take a look at the matches here. So again, got a bye in top 64, but beat Licky Licky, beat Charizard, lost to Exeggutor, beat Charizard, beat Mismagius, Magnezone, Wigglytuff, and then lost to Exeggutor. So this deck here actually beat every deck it went up against, basically, except for Exeggutor, at least in the first phase of the tournament. Got a bye round and then lost in top 32 to Weavile and Darkrai EX. Dragonite, again, we've talked about it a number of times on the channel. We haven't really covered it much in Space Time Smackdown. In theory, Dragonite has gotten better due to the inclusion of Pokemon Communications, allowing us to find those evolution Pokemon a little bit easier. Manaphy as well guarantees us at least a chance to accelerate those energies to Dragonite. We're not playing Vaporeon because, again, Vaporeon only works with water-type Pokemon, so we wouldn't be able to use that washout ability to move the energies to Dragonite anyway. But the cool thing about this deck here, it's all single-price Pokemon. Manaphy does fit fairly well. Like I said, it's a little bit more consistent now, hopefully at least with Pokemon Communications, but we're also playing, one copy of the Zapdos with Raging Thunder and Articuno, the single-price Zapdos and Articunos from Genetic Apex, which in their own right aren't terrible cards, but you know what? I think he probably wanted to run maybe just a single prize archetype deck here. And I do think that Dragonite isn't that bad. Unfortunately, no matter what, when you're playing a deck that has multiple energies, it's going to be a little bit inconsistent. I do think that Dragonite's Draco Meteor attack is one of the strongest attacks in the game. There's a lot of Pokemon right now that, maybe don't have a lot of HP that are going to be kind of set up on our opponent's board. Exeggutor does have a lot of HP. Giant Cape is going to help bring a lot of Pokemon above that 50 damage, threshold that Draco Meteor does in iterations of 50. So, I mean, overall in the format right now, I can't say that Dragonite is a really, really strong pick, but I did want to include at least a new version, or I guess an updated, Space Time Smackdown version of Dragonite that ended up competing in a tournament and actually doing fairly well. We are running, Dawns, which I guess is actually a pretty smart card to be playing with something like a Manaphy, because we aren't able to utilize Vaporeon, right, to move those energies. So Dawn allows us to do that to some degree. One Mars is interesting. I've seen some people playing Mars. I don't think it's a terrible card. In fact, it can actually be really good, as we saw in one of my previous videos. If you haven't seen it, it's my deck building challenge video where I made a deck with Rotom Fan and I included Mars in it. And if you flip heads with Rotom Fan, all of those cards go back into your opponent's hand. And then you can play Mars on the next turn, and then, shuffle those cards back into their deck. It can be a very, very fun strategy, but yeah, I mean, I thought it was kind of cool. Again, I don't think this is, I don't think Dragonite will really ever be meta, simply for the fact that it's a stage 2 Pokemon. It doesn't have too much HP, like Exeggutor is a stage 1 Pokemon with more HP and can attack for 1 energy, but technically speaking, Draco Meteor is an extremely strong attack, although inconsistent in its, in its aspects of how it targets your opponent's Pokemon. But technically, with Manaphy, Pokemon Communications, the deck technically has gotten better. And I do think that Dragonite is still a fun card, but I just wanted to include it. We haven't talked about Dragonite basically at all since Space Time Smackdown came out, so I just wanted to go ahead and bring it into a video and showcase it to you guys. So shout out to this player here, Scholar Kwan from Korea, going 7-3, getting some good wins in an online tournament, which is pretty fun and very interesting, at least in my opinion. Next up, we're going to take a look here at the Dark League Blitz Monday update. He went 7-3, this player here, and he was actually playing Marowak. So let's take a look at his matches here and see what matchups he ended up doing well against. Again, right off the bat, I'm seeing a lot of Dark type and a lot of Electric type. Makes sense for a deck like this to perform this well, to have matchups like this, but we did beat Darkrai Magnezone. We lost to Weavile Darkrai. We beat Dialga, beat Darkrai, beat Magnezone with Tauros, which is actually a list that we're going to take a look at later in this video. Lost to a Wormadam deck, beat another Darkrai, beat Aerodactyl, beat Darkrai Weavile, and then ended up losing to Magnezone and Skarmory. So playing and getting wins against a lot of meta decks. Let's quickly take a look at the deck list here. I don't think that Marowak is actually that bad. It saw some play in Genetic Apex. Again, there's very limited sort of EX fighting Pokemon. In fact, the only ones we have are like Marowak and Machamp and Aerodactyl. Oh, I guess now we have Gallade. I say limited and I just said 4. We do have 4 fighting type EX Pokemon. But Marowak has always kind of fallen to the wayside. In fact, even Machamp has seen a little bit more play as of recent. Marowak's a really interesting one. It's definitely sort of a high roll card. I don't think it's that bad. When paired with Lucario, it's actually very interesting in the sense that Fighting Coach is going to boost the damage that Marowak does by 20. However, the way that, Bone Meringue, the attack does, basically you flip 2 coins for 2 energies, and for each heads you do 80 damage. But here's the thing. if we flip 0 heads with Marowak, we're doing 0 damage. And even if we have a Fighting Coach Lucario on our board, we're not doing 20, we're still doing 0. So it is a little bit of a downside to Marowak, and yes, it is definitely an RNG card, but on the upside, technically, if we flip 2 heads, we're doing 160, but with Fighting Coach, we're doing 180. So I think it's really the concept that against something like an Exeggutor, even though we are weak to Grass, we have a little bit of a higher chance to 1-hit KO, or 2-hit KO rather, an Exeggutor with Marowak. And just in general, I think that Marowak isn't a terrible card. Lucario has found its way in a lot of different fighting type decks, but it hasn't found really a super meta partner yet. In fact, the best fighting cards aren't even, fighting decks rather, are playing like Magnezone with Hitmonlee and stuff. They're not really even playing Lucario, but I do think that Marowak is a fairly good card, albeit a little bit inconsistent. And we do have one of the small Marowaks as well, which in general is a pretty underwhelming card. It's similar to the Primeape from Mythical Island, where it just has it's a stage 1 Pokemon with a 1 energy attack, which is good in theory. 100 HP is a decent amount. Unfortunately, though, we are weak to Grass. So that's sort of the big downside, I think, to running the small Marowak, is even though we have 100 HP, if Exeggutor does flip heads for 80 damage, that's 100 with weakness, and we are getting 1-hit KO'd. But 40 damage plus Fighting Coach Lucario. The entire deck has low energy in its attack cost, so we should be able to kind of continuously attack once our Pokemon gets set up. Definitely better going second than going first, since we are stage 1 Pokemon with 2 energies in our attack cost. But overall, I wanted to include it. Like I said, I do think that it's a pretty fun deck. We do have 140 HP on Marowak EX. With Giant Cape, this does bring us to 160. That's a very good amount of HP to be at. Basically, that allows us to, most of the time, live 2 to 3 attacks from an Exeggutor EX, which can be pretty clutch as well. Lucario in its own right can do some good damage, so yeah, here's Marowak, actually doing fairly well in the tournament. Like I said, going 7-3, a smaller tournament, so again, you know, take it all with a grain of salt, but Marowak isn't a fighting card that we've talked really about at all since Spacetime Smackdown came out, for probably good reason. I think there might be better options from a fighting perspective, but again, if you're a Marowak fan, or if you wanted to play a fun fighting deck that wasn't, you know, any of the fighting decks that we talk about on a weekly basis, then here you go. Try it for yourself and let me know how it goes. Next up is going to be a Magnezone deck, so I know you're probably already rolling your eyes. Why are we talking about Magnezone? Here in the BEC Executive Series, Executive Series, or Executive Series, $1,000 prize pool, by the way. Massive tournament here. It actually didn't have too many players. I think it had about 500-600 players, but this Magnezone and Tauros deck went 11-3. Let's take a look at the matchups here. So again, a lot of early wins against Exeggutor. I assume some of these matches were probably people who didn't participate, namely this player here who went 0-10. I'm assuming he probably just did make it to his tournaments. Maybe also this one, but we did go 500, 2 wins, 2 losses against early Exeggutors, and then beat Darkrai, Magnezone with Greninja, beat Palkia, beat an Exeggutor, beat Darkrai Weavile, beat Charizard. Went on an absolute tear, really, up until top 16, where it ended up losing to another Exeggutor. So let's quickly take a look at this deck here, and I actually want to spend some time and talk about this list here, because basically what we're kind of looking at here is a combination of the old and the new. Something that saw a lot of play in the Mythical Island format was Tauros, and Tauros is a card that I think a lot of people have a little bit disrespected to some degree. I don't think that Tauros is going to be like the best card in the game now, but I do think that Tauros is underrated. I think 120 damage for 3 energies on a basic Pokemon with almost no drawbacks is a lot better than you think it is, especially in the late game, because right now I think the format is pretty heavily dominated by things like Exeggutor, and in general, Pokemon that aren't doing 100 damage. They're doing, you know, basically sort of 80 to 90 damage on a turn at the most, like things like Darkrai and Exeggutor, a lot of decks like that. Tauros with 100 HP with Giant Cape is 120, so we should be able to live a lot of attacks. 120 is a little bit of an awkward number, I'm not going to lie. It's good against things like Celebi, and it's good against Pikachu, Pachirisu, but most Pokemon are kind of at that 140 HP or higher range. Plus, Giant Cape is around. But here's the thing, we are running Druddigon, so we are able to kind of fix a little bit of that math. Again, the strategy here is Druddigon 6 in the active spot. We manually attach energies turn after turn to the Tauros, while allowing us to set up our Magnezone on the back end. So we have 2 really great single prize attackers hidden behind the sort of Druddigon stall wall, basically, that kind of sits into the active spot. So I really do like this deck. I think that as far as, you know, Magnezone and Magnezone pairings go, I think that Druddigon and Tauros is actually a really good combination. Druddigon is a little bit on the decline right now for a variety of different reasons. It's not as proactive as something like a Kangaskhan, but depending on the deck list that we're playing Druddigon in, it actually is a little bit better to still play Druddigon than it is to play Kangaskhan. Again, because we're kind of trying to manually attach these energies to Tauros and not necessarily the Pokemon in the active spot like a Kangaskhan. So it's definitely more of a sort of a backline build-up deck, but it does have a lot of potential. Technically, your opponent will have to go through both Druddigon, Magnezone, and Tauros, and that is a lot of damage potential, especially if our opponent isn't off to a super like great start or plays an early Sabrina or something like that. So I actually really do like this list. I think it has a lot more synergy than you might think. I think that Magnezone is just in general a really good card. 110 damage, 140 HP. It builds itself up. It is just obviously one of the most popular cards in the format right now, but this I thought was a really unique way, or I guess a new way of which to play Magnezone. We've seen it with Skarmory, we've seen it with Hitmonlee, the fighting package, we've seen it with Darkrai, but why not play it with something like Tauros and Druddigon, something a little bit new? Like I said, I think Tauros is a little bit disrespected in the current format. I think it's a lot better than people give it credit for. It's really nice, honestly, to be able to attack for 120 and then just against EX Pokemon, I should say. It does 40 damage, but 80 more against EX Pokemon. EX Pokemon definitely very popular in the format right now, but it's really nice to be able to do 120 and then have 120 HP with Giant Cape, but then no drawbacks, right? So we can just do 120 every single turn. If our opponent doesn't have an answer to Revenge KO us, then they're just gonna have to take another 120 damage, which is pretty significant, right? And I really do like Tauros and Druddigon as a combination still, even in this format. So I think this is a pretty underrated deck list. I think we might see it rise a little bit more in popularity. As far as a pure single prize archetype goes, this is one of my favorites. I don't know if it's gonna be as good as sort of the aggro Skarmory Magnezone deck, but I think it is still very, very good. And like I said, our opponent has to go through 3 of our Pokemon, which is probably going to be Druddigon, Tauros, and Magnezone. With the Giant Capes, that's actually quite a bit of HP to have to take 3 KOs. A lot of decks aren't doing that much damage in one attack, so I think that it's actually a pretty decent meta call right now, at least how the format is going. But yeah, shout out to Tauros. We haven't really talked about it at all. It hasn't found its way into many decks so far in this format, but I did want to talk about it because we haven't seen Tauros yet in a variety of different deck lists. So yeah, there it is. And that's a Sabrina for some reason. Okay, so next up we have a very interesting one from the same tournament here. Went 6-4. This is actually going to be a Wigglytuff Wormadam Dialga deck. This one really stood out to me when I saw it. It did go 6-4, so not the greatest win rate, if we're being honest with you, but we did beat Magnezone Skarmory, a couple Executors, beat a Palkia, lost to Skarmory, beat an Executor, lost to Darkrai, beat an Executor, and then lost to Executor and Skarmory and Magnezone. So the matchups here weren't super diverse. We basically only played like Skarmory, Magnezone, and Executor, but we did go 6-4. And again, this is another really fun Dialga deck. So let's go ahead and take a look at the deck list here. Now, Dialga is really on the decline for a variety of reasons. I don't think that Dialga is one of the best cards in the game right now, and I don't think that, Wigglytuff EX or Wormadam in their own right are exceptionally super strong, but the cool thing about this deck here is that you actually have a lot more damage potential than you might think. I think that status conditions right now, even with Lumberry being released in Spacetime Smackdown, are actually a lot better than people give them credit for. Yes, it's a little bit of an RNG strategy, but most things are in Pokemon Pocket. The ability to do 80 damage and then turn off your opponent's active Pokemon next turn on a 50-50% chance is actually a lot better than you might assume it is, especially right now given that most decks, again, are doing one-hit KO potential, right? So that means you get more turns to lock your opponent down with your status condition. That's what Wigglytuff does really, really well. This deck is interesting at first glance because we're only running one Dialga, so odds are we're going to lead off with Jigglypuff, and he's actually playing this Jigglypuff and not the one, the promo one that puts your opponent to sleep. That's interesting to take note. But technically, by turn 2, if we're going second, we can attack with Wormadam. It's a pretty strong card. It has a retreat cost of 1 as well. So one Dialga is definitely a little bit interesting. Only 1/5 of our deck is Dialga EX. That assumably would be the Pokemon we want to start with. But I actually think that Wigglytuff EX paired with Dialga is a lot better than people give it credit for. I really don't think it's that bad. And Wormadam as well is a really interesting card. Again, a very RNG-based card. I did use it in my deck building challenge video a couple days ago, along with Rotom Fan, as I was talking about. And yeah, you can pop off and do like 110 or 140 damage if you flip a couple heads with Wormadam. It can be really, really dangerous as a single prize Stage 1 Pokemon for only 2 energy in its attack cost. So that's another cool thing. Dialga with 1 Metallic Turbo can fully set up a Wormadam to attack. Same with a Wigglytuff, right? Because you get your manual attachment on the next turn. So technically speaking, Dialga can set up both Wormadam and Wigglytuff in a single attack. But like I said, I think that Wigglytuff is a little bit underrated right now. It's been power crept pretty slightly. I think when you compare this card to something like a Mismagius, which is also a Stage 1 Pokemon with 140 HP, with also a status condition attack that only does 10 less damage for 1 less energy. it's not as good, right? But I think Mismagius really has kind of taken the spot of Wigglytuff, but when you pair it with Dialga, you can set this card up very, very easily. It's a colorless Pokemon that you can pair with Dialga, so I do like it. I wanted to include this deck because I really haven't talked about Wigglytuff, again, at all since Space Time Smackdown came out, for good reason. It hasn't really seen any play. But again, if we are going to play Wigglytuff, I think that this is a really creative deck list, and it went 6-3, so it does have potential to win. And yeah, I don't really have too much else to say about it. I thought that it was really, really fun, really unique. Like I said, all of the videos we're talking about today, or decks that we're talking about in this video, are not going to be like super meta strategies. I wouldn't expect you guys to go and play a bunch of games with these decks and win every game. But if you wanted to play something that wasn't necessarily considered, you know, a top strategy or a super common deck, these could be really creative and interesting and fun decks to play that still have potential to win games. So yeah, shout out to this player who went again 6-4 at a pretty large tournament here with Wigglytuff and Wormadam. Very, very fun indeed. Okay, and next up, we're gonna talk about Dugtrio. This is a Dugtrio deck with Rampardos here. Let's take a look here at the matchup. So we went 7-3 at the Ursa Days Pocket Weekly. So actually, a deck that just bubbled outside of Top Cut at the 1,800 player, largest Pokemon Weekly tournament of this past weekend. And very interestingly enough, a very diverse, matchup spread here. Basically, we lost to Executor. We beat a Pachirisu here. This might have been, sort of a somebody who didn't show up for sure. But then we beat a Hypno Glaceon, lost to Executor, beat Darkrai, beat Pachirisu, lost to Magnezone Skarmory, beat Greninja, Druddigon, and then beat Magnezone and ended up beating Executor. So it went kind of on a tear here. 7-3 is a really good matchup spread against a lot of meta decks here. And Dugtrio is really, really funny. So I actually got rolled on like the ladder on random battles in game the other day by a Dugtrio deck. It's really, really funny. This card is a lot better, I think, than people give it credit for. Yes, it's an RNG card. I understand why it's not maybe the most common deck in the format, but Dugtrio really isn't bad. Like, no matter how you slice it, yes, something like a Cyrus or something like a Hitmonlee can hit around it, so there are a lot of counters to something like Dugtrio, but the ability to do 40 damage for 1 energy on a stage 1 Pokemon is good in its own right. However, we have a 50-50% chance to be immune from damage by our opponent's active Pokemon next turn. So Dugtrio is actually really, really funny. If you get lucky, if you flip some heads, it can be super, super aggravating for your opponent. One of the most fun decks in the entire game, in my opinion, or one of the most fun cards to play if you're the one playing it and you flip heads. So why not pair it again with something like Rampardos, which again is a low energy attack Pokemon here, but once it gets set up, it can do a lot of damage and really kind of fix some of that math from Dugtrio. So really, you kind of stall out with Dugtrio, hopefully evolve into your Rampardoses, and then attack into the late game. It's really no surprise to me. Yes, you technically could play something like Lucario in a deck like this to boost your dig damage, but you don't have a lot of HP, and we are weak to grass. So chances are, if we flip tails with the dig attack, we're just not going to live. There's enough Executors running around where I don't love being weak to grass type Pokemon in this particular sense of the word, but listen, it is actually a lot better than people give it credit for from an actual viability standpoint. I know people don't think that like RNG cards and cards that are based around coin flips are competitive, but just because something isn't competitive, like from a spiritual perspective, that doesn't mean that it's not actually able to win, and I think that's something that Dugtrio does actually really well. Again, if you get lucky and you flip heads 2 or 3, 4 times with Dugtrio in a row, you can win a lot of games, and that's really what it comes down to. Rampardos is just a strong card in its own right. Rampardos in its own right is actually kind of a meta card. We've actually seen this deck very commonly played in a variety of fighting decks, so again, not so meta strategy paired with a very meta card right now, but I did want to include it because it is something different. It's very fun and very interesting, and actually went, like I said, 7-4 in an 1,800 player tournament is very, very impressive, honestly. Okay, so next up we've got Zeppelin, who went 6-4 from the same Ursa Days Weekly tournament, and this was a very unique Infernape deck. So let's go ahead, take a look at his matchups. So he did make day 2, but he went 6-4 in day 1. Beat Articuno here, lost to Skarmory, lost to another Infernape, beat Aerodactyl, lost to Charizard, and then rattled off a bunch of wins here against Palkia, Darkrai, Palkia, and Gallade. So 7-4 is a pretty respectable, again, placement here. Winning 6 out of 10 games is not bad, especially with a non-meta deck. And this deck is really, really fun. This is Spiritomb with Infernape. It may seem very interesting at first glance, but the more I actually thought about it, the more I realized that Spiritomb and Infernape actually go together pretty well. Swirling Disaster is actually a very, very good attack. It does 10 damage to all of your opponent's Pokemon for 1 colorless energy on a basic Pokemon that has 80 HP. Yes, we're weak to Grass, but it doesn't really matter because Exeggutor, if it flips heads anyway, it's just going to KO Spiritomb. But if it flips tails, that we're living anyway. But 10 damage to all of our opponent's Pokemon is actually a bit better than you would think when you pair it with Infernape, which is a very consistent low impact attacker here for only 2 energies. It does 140. 140 is a very awkward number with Infernape. It's kind of the main reason why it doesn't see that much play, but with all of that extra damage that we're doing to our opponent's entire board with Swirling Disaster, that really can fix some of that math. With Infernape, it also allows us to use our Cyruses whenever we want to, and again, with Infernape, if we can, again, have maybe a Spiritomb on our bench with already an energy onto it, we can play Dawn, and we can go ahead and power up this Infernape in 1 turn. So hopefully if our Spiritombs, like if we can go into one Spiritomb and then into another one, basically, you know, and set up our Infernapes basically by turn 3 or 4, hopefully, we should actually be able to pretty viably KO most Pokemon in the game. Again, a lot of flexibility with Cyrus. Again, I'm not saying this is like a super meta strategy, but it actually does have some significant synergy here, and I do think that Spiritomb as a card is a lot better than people give it credit for. Yes, again, 80 HP is tough. Yes, we're weak to Grass, so even with Giant Cape, 100 HP, Exeggutor is hitting us for 100 damage if it flips heads, so we got to keep that in mind. But I actually think Spiritomb is a good card, and with Cyrus being one of the most common cards in the format right now, I would actually expect Spiritomb to see quite a bit of play as time goes on, unless it gets kind of power crept. But I really do like it, so yeah, here's an Infernape deck that's a little bit different than just sort of the, you know, Moltres strategy, which is probably going to be better or more consistent in most case scenarios. But like I said, we can go into 2 Spiritombs and then go into Infernape because they're single prize Pokemon. So the flow of the deck does make sense. The synergy does make sense. I really do like Spiritomb. I haven't seen it play in too many decks other than Darkrai and Weavile. So this was a really unique pairing that I just thought was really fun to talk about. A deck that I do want to play myself and try to test a little bit and see if I can, you know, win some games with it myself. But anyway, here it is. There's Spiritomb and Infernape. And then is this lastly? No, I've got 2 more decks. But lastly, we're going to talk about Gyarados and Rotom Wash. So a very unique Gyarados deck here that went 7-3, again, at the Ursa Days Pocket Weekly, just outside of top cut here. Beat Exeggutor, Darkrai, Charizard, Infernape, lost to a Gyarados with Greninja, beat Darkrai Weavile, lost to Skarmory, beat a Darkrai Magnezone, lost to Exeggutor, and beat Charizard. So actually got the win over a lot of other top meta decks in the game right now. Very unique deck list here. Let's go ahead and take a look. So this is Gyarados, but it's with Manaphy, and this is actually really, really cool to me. A deck like this with Misties and Gyarados, you don't actually need to play something like Vaporeon, which we often see with Manaphy. Rotom Frost is actually a really, really good Pokemon. It's better than people might expect it to be. It does, for 2 energy, it does Blizzard, that's 30 damage, and then you also do 10 damage to each of your opponent's benched Pokemon. So that spray damage can be really nice. Again, Rotom here kind of fixing that math that Gyarados kind of struggles with, doing 140 damage. It's a bit of an awkward number. Most people play Greninja with Gyarados to kind of fix that math and bring that up to 160 or even 180 if you give it an additional turn. That's good. That typically makes Gyarados a lot more consistent of an attacker and gives it the ability to take KOs. Frost Rotom does something similar, but it's a little bit different, right? It's just a basic Pokemon, still does bench damage, again, enables us to use things like Cyrus in the late game. Manaphy can both power up Gyarados and Frost Rotom in the same turn. If our Manaphy doesn't KO'd, we can go ahead, Oceanic Gift, then go into our Frost Rotom and kind of set up the stage for our Gyarados to sweep later on, that we can kind of rely a little bit more on manually attaching and using Misties to get it set up. So I actually like it. Again, I really wanted to showcase this deck because it includes Frost Rotom. This is a card that nobody's really playing. Again, probably for good reason. It's probably not as good as the Greninja deck or the Greninja variant of Gyarados, but it is still really, really cool. Still some good synergy here, and I do think that it's actually a pretty viable card. That's kind of the tough thing about a lot of these decks, right? And about Pokemon Pocket. From a competitive standpoint, from a meta standpoint, what we do is we often talk about the best decks, the best strategies, and there oftentimes are decks that are very, very similar, but very different in terms of the Pokemon that you play, and they do very similar things to a very similar version of the deck, but it just does it maybe a little bit less good, so 95% of the people end up playing the better option because it's similar anyway, but just better. But a deck like this is a great example of it because it's still good, it can still win games. It just isn't something that's going to see as much play as the widely accepted variant, which is fine. You know, I understand how you know, the metagame works and how TCGs work and how decks rise to the top, but kind of breaking through that wall and playing strategies that aren't necessarily common, but are still good and have still good synergy is really, really fun to me. So that's really what this video is all about. But yeah, shout out to Frost Rotom, Gyarados, Manaphy, a really, really cool deck. We still do not like Hitmonlees whatsoever. However, we do have one giant cape to protect those Magikarp. So I actually like it. I think that Gyarados is one of the strongest cards in the game. Yes, we're weak to Electric, but Frost Rotom's actually weak to Metal, which is interesting. Not that it really matters with Magnezone, but something to keep in mind. Yeah, very, very cool and fun deck list here. And then next up is going to be Garchomp. We did include Garchomp on our tier list, and we did talk about it a little bit yesterday, but just quickly, in the Ursa Days Pocket Weekly tournament, which we didn't really talk about in our Meta Monday video, there was a Garchomp deck that went 7-3 here. Looking at the matchups, we beat Weavile, Darkrai, beat Infernape, beat Magnezone, beat Executor, beat Charizard, ended up losing to Skarmory, beating Hitmonlee Magnezone, lost to the Machamp deck that we talked about in Meta Monday, beat Charizard, and then lost to Executor. So 7-3, just kind of missed, just missed top cut, similar to that Gyarados deck. But this is kind of a very common way that we're seeing people play Garchomp right now, is kind of with the fighting package. I think Hitmonlee Marshadow is really, really good. I think that Marshadow in general kind of fits pretty good with Garchomp because it also has one colorless energy in its attack cost, so only one fighting, similar to Garchomp, and then you would have to play again water energies and fighting energies in this deck, which allows us to play things like a Farfetch'd, which is very aggressive off the jump. It's compatible with both, of course, fighting and water energies because it's a colorless Pokemon. Makes Hitmonlee in this deck a little bit less consistent in the early game. A big reason why Garchomp just hasn't been a super meta deck is because it is a dual energy deck, and it's just a little bit more awkward to run decks like that. We talked about it in the Dragonite deck earlier in this video, but yeah, Garchomp continues to see a little bit of play. It's sort of one of the top kind of fringe meta or rogue decks of this format, and I do like to talk about it every now and then because it is still a fairly substantial card. Yes, with Cynthia, we do 150 damage. That is a good amount of damage for sure. It's a deck that I really do think is fun. Again, it's not going to be like top tier meta to any degree, but it is a single prize archetype, so our opponent does have to take 3 KOs to win this game. And I really, really like it. I think Garchomp in general is underrated. But yeah, I don't have too much else to say about it. I did just want to include at least one Garchomp in this video because it's been a little while since we talked about it. And I know some people do like Garchomp and they like to ask about it. So you might be wondering, what about my, Togekiss deck? Or what about, this deck or this deck? Why didn't you talk about it? Listen, I couldn't cover all of these sort of rogue decks or off-meta decks in this video, so I do apologize, but today what I wanted to do was just showcase the decks that were not only off meta and a little bit, non-popular, but also did well in tournament, right? That's something that I always got to focus on with these videos. I'm not just showing decks that are fun and creative and unique. I'm showing decks that win, that have results in tournaments. That way I'm not kind of just blowing smoke up these decks and just sort of, letting you know that they're fun or that they're good when there isn't really substantial data backing it up. At least all of these decks did perform well in online tournaments, and that's what we're all about here, is at least letting you know what's good and not good. None of these decks are going to be top tier meta in my opinion. However, that Gyarados deck is kind of interesting in my mind. But either way, there it is, guys. These are all of the surprising sort of new decks, off-meta decks, road decks of this past week of competition. And yeah, we're going to wrap up the video there, guys. Peace out. Have a good one. Thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you guys next time. We're almost at 10,000 subscribers, so if you're not subscribed to the channel, definitely subscribe. We're almost there. I would really, really appreciate it. Comment below what you think of any of these deck lists. What would you change? What other, kind of cards do you think are good but aren't necessarily meta right now? I would love to hear your guys' opinions down in the comment section below. But anyway, peace out, guys. Have a good one. We'll see you guys next time. And yeah, bye.